Welcome to the last but not the least session of the day. So we have three good speakers this afternoon, and they will definitely make it worthy to wait until this time of the day. Without losing time, I would like to invite our first speaker, who was the chair of the previous session, actually. So you've already met Dr. Mlungisi Селе. So he's from the Department of Science and Technology, Republic of South Africa. He's going to talk about the science and technology policy developments in South Africa.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I think it's important to indicate that in South Africa it's an important year. We'll be celebrating the centenary birthday of late President Mandela. If he was still alive, he would be turning 100. But it is also important to acknowledge because this presentation, this session has to somehow talk to international corporations and emphasize that, to acknowledge their contribution that various countries and institutions, they continue to make in helping us really to build our national system of innovation. It's almost 4 years since we started constructing it from a very small science-based system that was meant to serve the population of the few. Because of time, I don't think I will complete my presentation, but if I don't, I think these points, you could take them as take-home messages. Our system, and I think Maxim, I highly appreciate the presentation he did, because he did give you some insights into the South African system. It's relatively productive with pockets of excellence, albeit its small size. Small size in terms of people, institutions, and so forth. We're really shooting above our weight, as it were. The system is, I suspect, like most systems in developing or underdeveloped contexts, is challenged to respond to legacy questions and socio-economic development challenges. And I think the last 2 days, colleagues have articulated what are broad global and development challenges that various countries, and I think even developed countries, are now grappling with some of the social challenges, and I have no intention to repeat. And in the last 2 decades, it's been really a period of policy experimentation and learning, and we've used and benefited from strong international partnerships and networks. That's why, for instance, South Africa was awarded one of the big projects globally called the Square Kilometre Array, which some of you may be aware, which involves a range of institutions and bodies. And currently, of course, as part of responding to the ongoing challenges that we are facing, our system or our policy mix is undergoing renewal. And ISEC and H/SE is working with us in terms of doing foresight, which we are quite grateful. It is important, colleagues, from our point of view, to contextualize so that people can understand, because we've had to develop the STI system parallel to reconstructing and developing the country as we inherited it from the apartheid government. And these are the challenges that we continue to grapple with. Our economy, it's well known, the World Bank few days ago released a report that shows that we continue to be one of the most unequal societies, right? And our economy is refusing to grow. And again, we have the highest unemployment rate of young people under the age of 35 who are supposed to be productive, actively productive. And of course, the inequitable patterns of ownership, wealth, economic practices, which were initiated by segregation and apartheid, they continue to manifest itself even within the system of science, technology, as well as higher education. And some of the indicators that we use to measure our performance, they do reflect some of the challenges that we are having. Of course, we continue to grapple with the challenges posed by globalization and other challenges. I thought, I don't want to dwell, but it's critical for us to, because we grapple with SDGs, and it's part of how we would want to make sure that we not only benefit, but we contribute towards the implementation of SDGs. And in a sense, they sort of capture a range of issues that we are confronted with. In a very brief way, our policy mix generally in South Africa is characterized by, we're having a national development plan with a 2030 vision, and it's available on the line. It articulates the ambition of the aspirations of the country, and to a greater extent articulates its expectations of STI. But specifically in terms of STI policy mix, there are three sets of key policy documents, and Maxim referred to some of these earlier on. I think what is significant about the STI policy mix, for the first time, it set out the establishment of the NS, we call it National System of Innovation, but of course there are now global discussions about moving from NSI to and embracing transition systems and systems. I suppose the new policy renewal will have to grapple with that question as well. But for us, the system was important to draw the link between the STI system and the challenges that we're experiencing economically and socially. But also there is a stronger now move to make sure that STI contributes towards long-term sustainability and inclusivity, so that we don't have development that excludes. So inclusion and sustainability remains important. I alluded to the triple challenge of inequality, poverty, unemployment, and as conditions that are confronting our policy mix. And then, of course, this global shift to emphasize humanity at the heart, at the center of STI policy, and issues of governance which were articulated in previous presentations. We are also grappling with such issues. This slide, I don't want to dwell, but it just gives you a sense of what I mentioned about the employment and unemployment challenges in the country. I mean, you can see about 15 million South Africans are not economically active, I mean, out of 50 million population. And the world rankings on social progress would also show where we're doing well in terms of personal freedoms, choice, tolerance, but we're not doing so well on foundations of well-being, basic human needs, comparable to other countries. Okay, I mean, that's part of the international. This slide sort of summarizes our journey from 1996 up to where we are in terms of, if you want to understand South African STI policy, this is the trajectory that we had. We articulated our broad aspiration in 1996, and introduced the notion of the National System of Innovation. And then we conducted foresight between the period of 95 to 98, which led to the National Research and Development Strategy. That, in a sense, identified key strategic technology and social missions. And our priority, we identify areas we wanted to prioritize, such as biotech, ICT, advanced manufacturing, and astronomy. And you can see some of the indicators which were shared earlier on, the areas where we're doing well. In others, we are still following. And then, of course, following the OECD review of our system, we then responded by developing a 10-year innovation plan and borrowing from international concepts of grand challenges. And our grand challenges, we identified 5 in energy security, space. We didn't want to use the notion. Initially, we used climate change, but we then brought into global change and then social and human dynamics, because we understood the importance of society and how society interacts with technological change and development. And we then, of course, established new instruments, Technology Innovation Agency, which was meant to address the value of death challenge, or the innovation chasm. And then, of course, we established the National Space Agency and the intellectual property rights, which was meant to help us at least improve or protect publicly funded research. And from 2015 onwards, as I said, the process has been about reflecting. We've reviewed that 1996 white paper and the progress since, and we are now in the process of developing a new white paper, which would be followed by a new 10-year innovation strategy. And as I said, ISEC is working with us to then articulate. I've mentioned what are these. And in a sense, we also, because there are a number of initiatives that we have identified, and really our emphasis is on making sure that our system builds strong capabilities around knowledge generation, knowledge capacity, and these are some of the instruments that we have put in place. But of course, we have identified other instruments that are meant to help us exploit or utilize knowledge for public good and for economic competitiveness. But we also recognize the importance of utilizing STI to improve or support decision-making in government, and there are tools that we have established to ensure that public service innovation is also enhanced. But we're also having specific interventions to support small, medium enterprises, and then a range of funding instruments. You let me know, right? Colleagues, these are some of, it's just a summary of some of the, bibliometric outputs. We just did a comparative analysis to track where we were in 1996 and where we are in 2016. The green sign will show you areas where there's been some progress, and then you will see in certain areas it's been stagnant, and in other areas there's been a decline. I've highlighted, for instance, PhD graduates, foreign PhD graduates. I mean, it's mainly from the rest of the African continent. We're seeing a rise, and it's helping us to build the necessary intellectual capacity that's required to expand our pool. And then, of course, we've seen a rise in terms of international co-authorship, and again, our well share of publications has been increasing, but not at the rate at which we would like to see. Same with respect to patents and trademarks applications launched abroad. And then, of course, we've seen a rise in the articles that have been published over a period of time. Now, in terms of Bert, we had a discussion earlier on. It remains one of our concerns, the business expenditure on R&D. There are discussions internally to try and get business to improve investment in R&D, but it remains a huge challenge. We have a national target of 2% by 2018. We are at 0.8%. And business investment has been low. But of course, there's a general low business confidence in our economy, which is partly why it's struggling. 5 minutes. And what is another dimension of our system is that the productivity that we have observed is mainly, especially around publications, it's mainly drawn from 5 universities out of 23 or so. Only 5 universities, they contribute about 60% of our publications. And again, they hold 50% of all PhDs enrolled. So that's the nature of the system that we are faced with, and we have to grow. This is the slide about progress towards the realization of the national targets. You can see that we were growing up until the recession period, and then the graph went down. We're beginning to regain, but it's far from what we would have liked to do. In terms of the R&D expenditure in different sectors, it would seem to us that agriculture, forestry, and fishing has been, doing relatively better than other sectors like manufacturing in terms of R&D. But manufacturing generally in the country has been declining. And this is one of our fundamental concerns as an economy we're trying to introduce. One of the aspects of the system which we are quite celebrating, comparatively speaking, is mobile cellular subscriptions. And we viewed this as a potential advantage that if we utilize it and exploit it properly, it could take South Africa quite far. And yesterday I think the OECD colleague, when he was making presentations around this thing, I felt like, wow, some progress could be. And again, this slide would show you trends in terms of sector value added as a percentage of GDP. It gives you a sense of the issues. You can see manufacturing, mining over what has been happening over time. This slide, colleagues, because this is again about international networks, these are South African companies that they've done well globally. And a part of their strengths has been innovation. And ladies, I'm sure in the room, who would love diamonds, and you could see De Beers, Anglo-American for, it's an originally a South African company. And MTN, it's a cellular phone company. It's dominant in the continent, and it's and Sasol, it's one of those international companies that emerged during isolation. In terms of public sector innovation, these are some of the developments, local technologies that have been developed by South Africans, and they are playing, for example, in terms of revenue services. We've developed our own innovation system that's helping us to collect taxes. Okay, the last, this is about that project. As an example, it's an international project which we were awarded jointly with Australia. Of course, we are hosting a large part of it, and this is just a manifestation of how it would look like once it's fully implemented. And it's not just in South Africa, but few other countries in the continent as well. This is what that big project will do, colleagues. And of course, it may do other things, but those who are interested to learn a lot, this is what we think. Now, in conclusion, we all know that the world generally is in transition, and so do science systems. They are undergoing change. And the World Bank recently done a study, in fact, last year, and its conclusion was that South Africa is an untapped innovation based on the indicators that they were having. So we are being encouraged by that, and we hope that as we are developing new policies, perhaps we would be able to untap. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mlungisi, for excellent timing also. Sharp, 20 minutes. So without actually losing time, I would like to go to the next speaker so that we can leave some time at the end for a joint discussion all together. Please keep your questions about the case of South Africa, so you will have an opportunity to ask them to Mlungisi. So who is presenting? Evgeny. Okay. So I would like to now invite our colleague Evgeny Kutsenko. He will talk about in case of leaders, comparative analysis of Russian NIS dynamics. So the floor is yours, all of you.
Switch
So
to
we,
presentation.
okay, we start with you?
No.
Ah, okay.
Just a technical assistant.
Okay, technical assistant.
Thank you very much, Oscar and Katya, for helping to start my presentation. I will speak in Russian, so please use your headphones to know more about dynamics of Russian innovation system. Okay. Спасибо большое. Ну, для начала я, может быть, хотел бы сказать, откуда это появилась такая тема. Российская Федерация проводит много мероприятий инновационной политики, у нас есть стратегия инновационного развития. И несколько лет назад, а именно в 2015 году, так называемое открытое правительство, то есть это одно из министерств де-факто, решила провести некую инвентаризацию и экспертно, независимо замерить место России на инновационной карте, сравнив ее, Россию, с 15 лидирующими странами. Причем не только в статике, но и в динамике. И на этом основании попробовать как-то перенастроить, может быть, или дать рекомендации по совершенствованию инновационной политики государства. Соответственно, в 2016 году был первый доклад, нет, в 2015, в 2016 второй, а вот в 2017 начал готовиться третий выпуск, и уже, так сказать, посчастливилось нам в Высшей школе экономики выиграть этот контракт и принять участие в этой работе. Доклад еще не вышел, поэтому я на самом деле буду говорить о методологии и о выводах, но, так скажем, саму панель инструментов пока что показать не могу, но вот она выйдет как раз после формирования нового правительства в Российской Федерации. Доклад также должен быть и на английском языке. Что мы сделали? Ну вот наша работа заключалась, грубо говоря, в обновлении панели инструментов, или как по-английски dashboard, то есть выборка показателей, по которым Россию можно сравнивать с другими странами. Ну, очевидно, что таких показателей в сфере инноваций, в принципе, не так много. Ну, если начать искать, то окажется, что не так и мало. Вот. Перед нами ставили задачи уменьшить это количество. Изначально это было порядка 50-60 показателей. Но, как очень часто бывает, пытаясь уменьшить, мы только увеличили это количество. И найденные нами показатели, видимо, оказались настолько хороши, что заказчик не смог найти все силы в уменьшении этого дэшборда. То есть фактически это 108 показателей, индикаторов, по которым мы анализируем статику, мы анализируем рост России относительно России, соответственно, динамику во времени, а также мы анализируем относительную динамику относительно других стран, потому что очень часто так бывает, я вот вам буквально несколько кейсов сейчас приведу, когда год к году Россия растет, но относительно других стран, ведущих, она падает. Такое тоже бывает. То есть, соответственно, это первое. Второе, что мы сделали, изначально, соответственно, так сказать, воля правительства заключалась в том, чтобы сравнивать Россию только с самыми, ну вот, лучшими странами, как вот показалось. ну вот они были отобраны, флаги видны, то есть 15 таких вот стран. Мы, соответственно, сохранили вот эту выборку, но также сделали другие выборки, а именно добавив EU, добавив OECD, добавив БРИКС, понимая, конечно, что по БРИКС очень мало показателей сопоставимых есть. И, наконец, сделали выборку, куда мы все вот эти вот 4 группы, соответственно, суммировали. Плюс, помимо краткосрочного замера, то есть год к году, последнего замера, что от нас требовалось, мы еще стали контролировать долгосрочные тенденции, потому что очень часто так бывает, что, что какие-то изменения – это краткосрочные случайные флуктуации, с одной стороны, ну, а с другой стороны, очень, конечно, интересно сопоставлять именно долгосрочные и краткосрочные периоды. Следующий. Next. Буквально перед выводами, наверное, последний слайд с методологией. Соответственно, вот эта панель, она построена таким образом, что это как бы дом, где наверху у нас показатели, на самом деле, уже не инновационные совсем, показатели эффектов, куда мы включили продолжительность жизни, включили энергоэффективность, включили продолжительность жизни, да, ну, ряд других, разумеется, индикаторов включили, как GII или Global Competitiveness Index, соответственно. То есть это как бы крыша дома получается. Мы полагаем, что инновации, если они не влияют на это, ну, может быть, они бессмысленны в какой-то степени. Соответственно, следующий этаж нашего дома – это как раз inputs and outputs, это, собственно, инновации. Очевидно, что inputs – это разного рода ресурсы, финансовые или человеческие. Результаты – это у нас, ну, и результаты, и ресурсы у нас бьются на 3 части. Это R&D, это commercialization, innovation. И, наконец, у нас есть фундамент этого всего дома, framework conditions, куда мы включили человеческий капитал, инфраструктура, зрелость отраслей, институт и ценности. Ну, прочие методологии сейчас не имеет, на самом деле, наверное, смысл объяснять. Если кому интересно, мы, с одной стороны, готовы объяснять, с другой стороны, готовы вам выслать, когда это как раз-таки можно будет подробно изучить. Соответственно, осталось ждать несколько месяцев. Надеюсь, что в мае, в июне это будет уже все. Следующий слайд. Ну, вот просто выводы. Я хотел бы на них остановиться. Это последний замер, возможный последний, потому что, как мы понимаем, по разным показателям, разные периоды сравнения. Международная статистика зачастую запаздывает на 2 года, а где-то, к сожалению, она запаздывает больше, в зависимости от индикаторов. Ну, соответственно, где находится Россия, какова динамика. Ну, если говорить про эффекты, про нашу крышу, к сожалению, все-таки мы отстаем очень сильно и от топ-15 стран, и от выборки 45, где еще ЭСР и Европейский Союз. Отстаем по производительности труда и по продолжительности жизни, безусловно. При этом Россия в последние годы довольно сильно рванула в Global Competitiveness Index, Doing Business и прочее. Ну, по Doing Business, наверное, во многих странах такая же есть практика. У нас, по сути дела, государство целенаправленно работало, и были разработаны дорожные карты, как исправлять ситуацию по тем или иным индикаторам. Ну, как бы эти результаты дали свои плоды. Хотя хотелось бы, конечно, чтобы производительность труда все-таки урысла вместе с продолжительностью жизни. Ну, будем надеяться на будущее. Что еще вот говорить? Если вот взять контур инноваций, надо сказать, что Россия, конечно, стала отставать последние, может быть, год-два. То есть пик у нас 12-13 был положительной динамики. После этого все-таки началось замедление, либо относительное падение. Относительно, это значит, что у нас может быть рост относительно России к России прошлому году, но большинство стран-лидеров все-таки ускорилось и стало наращивать разрыв с Россией. И особенно это касается показателей результативности, то есть показателей output, а не input. По инпуту все не так плохо. По затратам государства много тратит. безусловно. По стартапам, например, по количеству стартапов тоже мы используем такую данную, как карта стартапов, международный источник. А вот если мы будем брать, например, публикации или патенты, мы сразу сталкиваемся с некой неопределенностью. О чем я говорю? Ну, например, у нас растет доля статей российских ученых в международных научных изданиях, но все-таки цитируемость остается низкой. Количество есть, качество, наверное, будет расти, будем надеяться, в следующий раз. Либо патентование. У нас есть положительная российская динамика, вроде бы, но если мы берем международную патентную активность, то все-таки это сейчас недостаточный уровень. И так далее. Но все же, если сосредоточиться и определить, наверное, главное слабое место, это R&D, это commercialization или это innovation, наверное, это commercialization. То есть фактически у нас все показатели в красной зоне, то есть это отставание больше, чем в 2 раза от среднего по выборке, будь то 15 стран или 45, и мало где наблюдается положительная динамика. Вот. Причем, да, ну ладно, это я о минусах, у нас есть и плюс, конечно, это человеческий капитал. По-прежнему он остается сильной стороной российской инновационной системы. Даже в сравнении с топ-15 стран Россия на уровне, либо даже обгоняет по численности населения с высшим образованием, по качеству школьного образования. У нас растет качество университетского образования. Тут программы такие, как 5-100. Очень, ну, то есть это попытка вывести как минимум 5 наших университетов в топ-100 ведущих мировых рейтингов университетов. Эти программы дают свой результат. Но вместе с тем, если брать показатели доли населения, участвующего в непрерывном образовании, тут мы на данный момент отстаем. Если спускаться ниже, вот по этому фундаменту, то что еще мы видим? Мы видим некое отставание в развитии инфраструктуры, транспорта, энергетики, телекоммуникации. И мы фиксируем такой интересный момент, как, несмотря на внутрироссийский рост, ну, так скажем, доли высокотехнологичных секторов в экономике, как промышленных, так и наукоемких услуг, все-таки в ведущих странах эти процессы идут быстрее. Действительно, вот эти процессы реиндустриализации, ну, это не слова, то есть действительно страны стали резко наращивать долю высокотехнологичной промышленности. У нас эти процессы тоже есть, но все-таки в последнее время динамика несколько потеряна. Что интересного, вот если, как сказать, если в детали больше не уходить. На самом дне нашей пирамиды, нашего дома, внизу фундамента у нас лежат институты. Это показатели прежде всего doing business и governance indicators, то есть это World Bank все дает, и ценности, то есть институты ценности в фундаменте. А ценности мы взяли из World Value Survey, потому что очень важный источник. Нам показалось, что это наиболее надежно, потому что там есть несколько волн исследований, максимальное количество стран задействовано. Почему это интересно? У нас вот в России, по сути дела, весь прошлый год тема ценности была на форумах, на самых ведущих, как Петербургский международный экономический форум или Открытые инновации, главной темой. Соответственно, все-таки Россия, где она? Она ближе к Европе, она к Азии, она как третья, средняя. И как под эти ценности должна подстраиваться экономическая система, какие действия должно делать государство. Ну, понимаете, очень важно все-таки. Вот тут, наверное, определиться, как показалось. Ряд исследований показывало, что россияне какие-то другие, может быть, там более патерналистские и прочее, может быть, тем самым находя некое оправдание в тех или иных действиях. Что показало наше сравнительное исследование с странами 15 EU, еще раз повторю, OECD. Ну, показало только то, что россияне все-таки мало чем отличаются. Вот. И в институтах отличия гораздо больше. Разрыв гораздо существеннее с ведущими странами, чем в ценностях. Причем, несмотря на то, что по институтам у нас были продвижения, я сказал про doing business, да, легкость ведения бизнеса здесь безусловно. То есть Россия выходит из красной зоны. А вот что касается госуправления, что касается деятельности судов, разрыв до сих пор существенный. А вот если брать ценности, то у нас есть много сильных сторон. Это толерантность, это доверие государственным институтам, но не полиции и суду. Здесь большой разрыв, полное недоверие. Позитивное отношение к науке и технологиям. Сегодня день космонавтики, очень много в Фейсбуке радости. То есть действительно это то, что, может быть, отличает нас в положительную сторону. Престиж предпринимателя, как ни странно, тоже здесь нет никакого отставания. Правда, низкая готовность к предпринимательству. То есть престиж вроде есть, но если брать европейский инобарометр, там есть такой вопрос, то все-таки готовы ли вы в ближайшее время начать свой бизнес? Вот тут все-таки не так много готовы людей. Но непонятно, это ценность или это просто денег, может быть, нету и недоступны кредиты и прочее. Это уже вопросы трактовок. Но вот главная такая диспозиция, что институты вроде как должны меняться прежде всего, и в это наше слабое место, а не ценности, ну, нам показалось, что это очень важно было зафиксировать. Следующий слайд. Мы решили немножко, конечно, поиграть с этими данными еще. Мы решили провести кластерный анализ, потому что, ну, конечно, все-таки мы получили от экспертов, много раз это обсуждали, понятный совершенно фидбэк. А почему вы сравниваете себя, там, не знаю, с Австралией, с Японией, еще с кем-то? Ну, ведь есть же транзитивные страны, как вот они раньше назывались. Почему бы не сравнить себя с, там, не знаю, с Польшей или с Чехией? Не это ли будет правильно? И тогда вы точнее свои сильные и слабые стороны отметите. Мы решили провести кластерный анализ. Понятно, что его результаты будут зависеть и от метода, и от количества кластеров, это хорошо известно, и от, самое главное, индикаторов, по которым вы проводите этот анализ. Мы сейчас говорим только об индикаторах эффектов, то есть это наша крыша, да, как говорится, вот, всего нашего инновационного дома. Мы вот получили вот эту вот группу из 4, ну, то есть вся группа, совокупность этих стран-лидеров разбилась на 4 группы. Действительно, Россия здесь не лидер. А вот, кстати, по ценностям мы проводили такое исследование, это уже не суда. Мы как раз к лидерам ближе. Но вот если брать все-таки по продолжительности жизни, по зависимости труда и так далее, Россия ближе к Болгарии, Венгрии, Греции, Польше, Румынии, Словакии. Другие группы это, как мы отметили, назвали это долгоживущие средняки, да, как правило, это страны более Южной Европы, соответственно, ну, может быть, не такие выдающиеся, так сказать, параметры инноваций и производительности, зато продолжительность жизни такая же, как в самых развитых странах. Нужно ли, так скажем так, стараться и бежать, когда у вас хороший климат, оливки и море? Вот. Заставляет задуматься. Скандинавские страны отдельно выделились, конечно, это лидеры по большинству международных рейтингов и абсолютный лидер. Тут они представлены. У меня 3 минуты, я буду быстро. Следующий слайд. Мы сравнили Россию с этими, ну, уже, наверное, не такими уж и лидирующими странами. И оказалось, что наши слабые места, они слабые не только по отношению к лидерам, но и к этим странам. Увы. То есть коммерциализация и результативность инновационной деятельности, а именно доля инновационной продукции в общей отгрузке, инновационная активность компании, доля новых для рынка инноваций, к сожалению, это у нас в отставаниях, увы. И то же самое с институтами, вот по этим конкретно блокам. То есть вот такие вот разрывы есть. Ну, наверное, это подтверждает отчасти нашу гипотезу и позволяет нам все-таки уточнить наши выводы по профилю России. Следующий. Ну, буквально еще одна, так сказать, инновация. Что мы попробовали еще сделать? Тут предыдущие вещи назывались панель инструментов, дэшборд. Это просто вот, грубо говоря, вот вы летите в самолете, у вас много приборов. Вы понимаете, да, соответственно, где вы находитесь. А мы захотели еще панель инструментов. То есть еще рычаги, чтобы были. И чтобы вы понимали, какой рычаг на какой показатель воздействует. Вот. Мы собрали 24 программы, которые нацелены на стимулирование инноваций в России. Не буду их перечислять, мы там проанализировали и так далее. Разные министерства их реализуют. И Минэкономразвитие, и Минпромторг, и Минкомсвязь, Минсельхоз, Миноборнауки, разумеется. Разные институты развития. Это и Сколково, и Фонд развития промышленности, и РВК, и Фонд содействия инновациям. Отобрали все самое существенное, обсудили с экспертами. Дальше, соответственно, мы из этого всего, из этой нормативки вынули ключевые показатели эффективности и сопоставили их вот с этим дэшбордом. Ну, вот получился такой вот ужас. Вот. Мы его называем волосы, вот, но тут, так сказать, очень много фантазий у всех могут быть. То есть, ну, честно говоря, такой обескураживающий результат, слабо поддающийся анализу. То есть получилась полная путаница в то, что вот разные меры, реализуемые разными органами власти, ну, к сожалению, вот совершенно по-разному выбирают ключевые показатели эффективности. Ну, такой вот микс. Разобраться в нем очень сложно, но что мы заметили при предварительном таком анализе? Мы заметили, что очень часто показатели формулируются в таких терминах, в которых невозможно верифицировать, то есть в статистике они сформулированы по-другому почему-то. То, что мы видим, эта терминология, да, соответственно, очень часто под показатели, если они новые, нету методологии их проверки, иногда выбираются показателями, по которым нету международной сопоставимости и прочее, прочее. То есть вот такие вот вещи были вылеты. То есть по-хорошему, конечно, вот в плане целеполагания надо наводить какой-то порядок. То есть очень много инструментов у нас создано в государстве, они работают с разной эффективностью. Надо ли здесь их синхронизировать или не надо, это большая дискуссия отдельная. Но то, что хотя бы нужно навести порядок в сфере мониторинга, в сфере целеполагания, измеримого целеполагания, ну, на наш взгляд, это бесспорно. Так сказать, может быть, примитивный вывод, но он подтвержден, мне кажется, так вполне научно оказался вот этими вот волосами. Ну и, безусловно, то, о чем говорили мои коллеги на предыдущих сессиях, связано с policy evaluation, это все очень важно. Что одно дело, вы на верхнем уровне установили соответствие статистическими показателями и теми KPI-ами, госпрограмм, да, и мер конкретных поддержки, а другое дело все-таки, ведь не только меры поддержки воздействия оказывают, да, там и частный сектор, безусловно, и глобальные тренды, поэтому, безусловно, необходимо идти глубже и разрабатывать отдельный инструментарий для policy evaluation и impact assessment. Все, спасибо. Thank you very much.
Evgeny, thank you very much for this very well elaborated and very rich presentation. And Екатерина, thank you very much for assisting the presentation. So now I would like to invite our last speaker for the day, Wольfganг Полт. Wolfgang works at Joanneum Research, Austria, and he's gonna talk about mission-oriented STI policies for the future and what lessons from the past. Wolfgang, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Do you have a presentation? So
Yeah,
that may
sure.
not work. You can. Mhm. Uh-huh.
Does it work? No, it does not. Yeah, if you allow me, I would like to stand because I'm already very tired, even more tired than you must be at this point of the conference. But as I said in the morning, I only had 3 hours sleep, so I would try to keep myself awake and you likewise. So I very much count on you guiding us through the presentation. It's a very lengthy one, but I won't bother you with all the slides. But it takes us back to a topic that we already addressed in the morning, and it is
perceived to be a very, very important one, at least in the discussions of the European Union, and that is mission-oriented STI policies. Next one. The background of all this is that the interim evaluation of Horizon 2020, the framework program for research and technological development in Europe, which is the single largest research program worldwide, even though it accounts for a small share of the total R&D outlays of the member states of the European Union. The interim evaluation of this program, plus a report of an expert group that tried to make suggestions on where to develop the framework program in the future, both stress the need for an impact-focused, mission-oriented approach for the next framework program, for which FP9 is the current working acronym. Why that? Because over and over, the evaluations of the framework programs have produced positive results, very much like the developments of Russia. Everything is improving a little bit here and improving a little bit there. But generally, there was a dissatisfaction with the overwhelming targets, making Europe the most innovative region in the world, as the Lisbon summit a few years ago set out as a target. Nothing of that sort happened. We saw the same stagnation, for example, in R&D intensity on the aggregate level in Europe, as we have seen in other areas of the world. And especially in terms of outcomes, in terms of tangible contributions of the research that is being funded by the European Union, there was dissatisfaction with this output. Doesn't seem, of course, there are pockets of excellence, there are examples of good use, there are examples of substantial impacts, but all in all, the target that the European Union has set itself with Horizon 2020, and remind you that the largest pillar, as they are called, was devoted, or still is devoted, to addressing grand societal challenges. There was the feeling we don't get what we expect or what we warrant from the investments, and we have to try something new to increase this impact. That was basically the motivation to ask for more mission-oriented approach. Now, Georg has already said in the morning, if you are old enough, you have seen this around, because mission orientation basically was the starting point of organized governmental technology and innovation policy. I will come to that in a minute. But based on this perception of a problem, 3 studies were commissioned. One by Mariana Mazzucato, which was presented in end of February in Brussels very recently, which basically reiterated the rationale of the whole approach. In my perception, it did not very much more than recycle what she has been doing in other fields. But it was a valuable exercise in reminding us that actually there have been examples of mission orientations around, which we could take as a starting point for developing the idea further, and that there is a basic rationale which at least potentially holds the promise for more outputs. And then the European Commission almost a year ago commissioned 2 studies in which my organization was involved as well. And these studies were given the task to map and screen all over the globe, that is EU 28, Korea, Japan, Russia, US, what you have, mission examples of what could be labeled as mission-oriented policies map these, characterize these activities, and try to draw lessons for what can we learn for governance structures that work, for goal-setting types that work, for the future implementation of the framework program. And that's what we did, and that was quite laborious because we started from a very vague concept of mission orientation. But yet we were tasked with characterizing and collecting evidence on these initiatives, of which we did not have a very concrete definition from the beginning. So basically, we developed the definition, which we finally ended up with, underway and working on the material, by this also leaving out then in the end initiatives that did not really comply to what we in the end defined as mission-oriented policies. And there is still a great uncertainty in all policy circles of what do we want to understand as mission orientation. It's a broad concept. It has a history. If you see it, you know, okay, this could be one, but we were still lacking when we started a very good founded definition of mission-oriented. I'm not sure whether we provided it in the end, but at least we hoped that we could clarify the concept a bit further. Next one. Some of you might know this graph. It's a very impressionistic graph, which shows from this, the perception of me and some colleagues about the development of large-scale approaches to science, technology, and innovation policy in the post-war period. And as I said, the classic mission-oriented approach basically was at the start. And the role models, of course, were derived from the developments in the Second World War. It was the Manhattan Project, the development of the nuclear bomb. It was the post-war development in aerospace industry, the Apollo project. And these projects were seen as successful role models which could be used to develop science, technology, and innovation for political purposes, which is what missions are in a sense about. But this approach in the 60s, 70s faced some limits and fell out of favor for some inherent flaws I will later address. And there was good reason to develop other approaches, like the focus on key civilian technologies, or later on the focus on innovation systems, which is a completely different approach because it addresses the generic features of innovation systems and not necessarily the topics, or it doesn't set concrete targets, but it tries to improve the working of the system as a whole. But recently, latest from mid-1990s onwards, there was discussion on maybe if we embark on a new type of mission, which would be a modern version of a targeted policy that would be fitted for the systemic challenges that we are facing, might be an idea to be employed in the future in the set of policy approaches. As you see here, the picture implies that the policy approaches coexist, even if they over time are shifting their weight. They would not go away, and I think for good reason, because each and every of these approaches does have an own rationale or an intervention logic, which still is around, which still is valid, but changes probably over time with the development of the economy. Next one. So as I said, we were challenged to define mission orientation in research and innovation, and of course that's not the whole story, because it confines the subject of analysis to mission-oriented research and innovation, while mission orientation can and in all regularity is a much larger task. If you just think about the Sustainable Development Goals that have been alluded to already, this is mostly, they span much beyond what and I can achieve. There are policy actions asked for in very many other policy spheres, and quite often the contribution of research and development to achieving the targets is a small one. So that, having that in mind, we found that even when you focus on mission-oriented R&I initiatives, that there is a historical development and a multitude of different approaches that can reasonably be called mission-oriented, and that there is not a single one. There is no single type of mission-oriented policy, but there is rather a whole array of different policy approaches that can reasonably be called mission-oriented. But what then constitutes a mission orientation? And we found from the case studies, the interviews, the mapping, the surveys that we did, that a core of a concept of a mission, and we defined this as being large-scale interventions aimed at achieving a clearly defined mission that is a goal or attempting for a solution of a problem within a well-defined time frame with an important R&I component. That is, of course, as DG RTD was asking and commissioning the study, we were confined to this. But we kept on saying that this is not the whole of mission orientation, and it might not even be the most important ones. Next one. We found other characteristics of mission orientation R&I initiatives, like they can be public or private, they are ambitious, exploratory, groundbreaking, cross-disciplinary, affecting a number of industrial sectors and social contexts, and so on and so on. But these characteristics you find also in other systemic policies. There are a lot of policies around that are also ambitious, exploratory, and groundbreaking, or cross-disciplinary, or what you have. But the real defining factor is, that is what sets mission orientation apart from other approaches, is their level of directionality and intentionality with respect to specific targets. And that is a whole of a difference to what the European Union is doing now. Because sometimes we were confronted with the opinion that, that we are doing this already. And this is not only to be seen, an opinion to be heard on the European level, but also on national level. We're doing this already because we're doing grand challenges. We're addressing climate change and food security and cyber security and what you have. This is oriented research, but it is not mission oriented, because mission would rather be something, I want to achieve a concrete target until this point in time. I would allocate resources in a coherent way. I would set up a governance structure, not necessarily of the type of creating NASA or having a project structure like for the Manhattan Project, but a definitive guiding governance structure that is able to initiate, monitor, and implement the policies. And this is a whole lot of a difference to the policies that we see now. And the question now is, can we establish such types of policies? Is there the governance capacity around to be able to install such policies? That's the crucial question. And the answer of whether we should embark on mission orientation or not depends very much on the answer of the question, are we capable of providing such governance systems or not. I would skip through most of the rest if you just go on. Yeah, these are the examples that we looked at. This is the extreme types that we found, and they have entered kind of the lingo of the European Commission. On the one hand, we found what's been called accelerators. These are more narrowly defined missions with a strong technological target. Very much, but not completely like the old types of missions. But what we are discussing under the heading of new mission orientation is approaches that try to transform systems. And I would give an example of that. And there are very many of this type around. For example, there are targets, if you press again, yeah. There are targets with respect to the quality of air in cities. There are concrete targets. We want to have clean air in all EU cities by 2025. They are measurable because there are WHO norms on all the sorts of parts of air by which air quality can be indicated. And this can be translated into technical targets. But if you think of it, it is a very complex matter because the quality of the air in a city is determined by a lot of factors like urban traffic, housing, industry, and the portfolio of policy instruments that you need to address all this is quite considerable. It stretches from infrastructure investment, regulation, social innovation, if you want to change the mix of use of transport, of means of transport like bikes or cars, you must induce changes in behavior, which very often need type of social innovations. It needs public sector innovation when you think about the provision of urban traffic. There is a huge public component to that, likewise in housing. They all have huge components which are directly addressed by regulation, not necessarily by research, but even for research there is a lot of things to do, but there is a small part compared to the other elements that you have to take into your hand. Now that's a formidable challenge, and we don't have nowhere the governance structures that would allow this to be implemented in a very coherent and concise way that would fulfill the criteria of a mission-oriented policy. Next one, or just browse through the next one. These are the examples that we looked at into more detail. We found failures and successes, and we wanted to distill from the failures and successes some characteristics that we could convey to the European Commission in order to bring the discussion on whether mission orientation could be designed and how should it look like one step further. Yet another one, yet another one. They will be all described in the reports. They are not yet available because we delivered them 4 weeks ago and we are still waiting for the comments and the feedback of the Commission. But once they are decommissioned, they would be put on the web and you would see all the material that I just had to skip now in great detail. And we can, I'm sure that there will be a lot of discussions in the years to come where we can further elaborate on that. Next one, yeah. Next one. Okay, here we are. The observations on what constitutes a successful mission-oriented policy include, in our perspective, and again, this is expert opinion, if you like, because we were really screening a lot of case studies, but we were asked to look at case studies from all over the places in all different areas like health, energy, mobility, and so they don't lend themselves really to statistical analysis. In the end, you end up with a very few number of halfway comparative cases in each of the cells. So it's not of the type of indicators and statistical analysis that you have been presented with in the past hours or so, in which this very institute excels so much. But this is very much a mixture of qualitative and quantitative assessment. And in the end, it's the experts that say, we think this is a successful example, we think this is something to be followed, or we think this is something to be further explored because it has the potential to be a role model. Having said that, these are the conclusions that we came up with. They might still undergo some discussion and refinement when the Commission comes back to us, but I think basically this is it. The first finding, and that's even a normative statement as well, and not a positive as only, is that there is not one and only type of mission-oriented policies. They can and should take very different forms and scales between the two ideal types I have been presenting you, between the accelerator and transformer type of mission orientation. And there are a lot of mixes of these elements. For example, how strong the target is defined, how much actors are involved, how many different policy instruments you have to apply. This changes by field and by context. And then there are types, policy approaches of an umbrella type, as we have called it, and these are broad brushed policy approaches like the German Energiewende. They are oriented towards the sustainable development goals as far as they concern energy. They have a long history, but they have been broken down in different segments, sub-targets that have been established in different areas of policy. Some of them are not necessarily what we would call mission orientation, but they would be just research initiatives of a traditional sort. But they are carried out under an umbrella which has a basic goal, which has a timeline, resource allocations, and what so on. And while there are cultural and political factors that have an influence on the practices, so this turns out different in different countries, we think that we could identify some general characteristics of successful mission-oriented policies that are more or less the same in all countries. And the first one is that most of the successful missions, they stem from a sense of urgency. One of the successful examples was a Dutch policy which basically came out of a huge flood they had in the 1950s, and they started to, in a huge exercise of which R&D was just one part, a very small one, but it was a very mission-oriented program to secure their dams, the coastline, and this sense of urgency you can have in other missions as well. Remind you that Manhattan Project was carried out under a strong sense of urgency, and this applies to quite a number of missions. If there is not a strong sense of urgency, you find it politically very difficult to rally the most important stakeholders behind the target of the mission. Next one.
We have 0 time now.
Yeah, 0. Okay, sorry. I'm almost done. First, second, then there must be a fertile ground in terms of scientific and industrial capacities and political and cultural environment. some missions can take you a step further, a large step further, but beware that great leaps forward sometimes end with the tiger falling flat on the nose. So the target that you set yourself must be in a sensible relation to where you start from and to the means that you apply. Then it is very important and a very deep, one of the main elements of successful or prescriptions of a successful mission-oriented policy is that the public organizations must set long-term targets and commitment to clearly identified mission and then stay on course. We've seen quite a number of examples where changes of course, changes of targets ruined initiatives because then the strategic signal to the other actors was lost and the buy-in of the stakeholders to the mission targets was lost as well. Very often, not in all cases, but very often mission-oriented policies are managed by clearly identified and empowered governance body, which can be held responsible for the achievements of the missions. There can be substitutes to that, close substitutes, tight interministerial coordination, what you have. But they are hard to achieve. This is a trick not to be pulled off very easily in any political system. The solution by which you are more likely to be successful in implementing a mission-oriented policy is to create a clearly identified and empowered governance body. For example, talking practical terms, when you think about transforming the current set plan of Europe, that's a strategic energy technologies plan, into a real mission, which is not at the moment, you should at the same time think about an European energy agency or something like that. Otherwise you would fail in the context of 28 countries that would each and every one pursue his or her own policy. Next one. Yeah, I think that's the last one. Okay, new forms of governance are desperately needed, but we are very uncertain of whether they can be established at all. We have seen successful missions on the national level, on the regional level, but we are yet to see successful mission implementation on an international level. Maybe we have to arrive there because some of the problems are of a kind that would ask for international collaboration, but maybe we need a catastrophe first to create the sense of urgency that would bring governments together and address the problem in a coordinated way, giving up then national competencies. And I skipped the last two, and the final slide is then, yeah, I said this. There are also pitfalls with respect to the old or accelerator type, but I think they pale against the challenges that we face when thinking of really implementing a new type of missions, which we would very much need in some cases, but still it's doubtful whether at the moment we are capable of setting up the governance structures that are needed for this implementation. Thank you very much. Sorry for...
Okay. Thank you, Wolfgang. Actually, you have performed great for a person who slept only a few hours. So, great job. Actually, while I invite our discussant, Sami Mahrum, here from INSEAD, United Arab Emirates, while he's taking his seat, I'd like to turn to the audience to see if they have any questions for our speakers. So, yes, please.
So my question is to Wolfgang. Huh? No, it's working. It's working. Yes. So I fully agree with a lot of things you said about difficulties which arise with a mission-oriented policy. But what you didn't mention is what might be crucial is how to define really a quantitative target, which I think is important for having a mission combined with a clear point in time. And this must be also quite realistic. I think what is a big failure in the end of previous EU R&D policy in goal setting is also Lisbon, in a way. So in the end, it was never realistic to reach Lisbon at an EU level. And so nobody should wonder that this is in the end a failure, but if you define a mission in the same style, giving the goals for the mission, quite unrealistic, you will always fail also with mission-oriented policy types. And so you didn't address these issues, and this is crucial, how to arrive at a definition on which stakeholder can agree, which a target which is challenging, but also in a way realistic. And how can they agree on that, an ambition and realistic target?
Good question.
Short answer, please.
Yeah, the short answer is that there is no recipe for it, but it has to be taken into account that, like the great leap forward, if you set the target too far away from where you are standing now, it's a kind of voluntaristic policies, and unfortunately, governments that believe very much in their own power and capacity are even more likely to set such targets than those that know about their limits and the scope and barriers to interventions. But having said that, some of the missions were actually successful because they had a concrete target, either in scientific terms, like the human brain projects or the war on cancer, or other types that we looked at. They didn't miss it on the spot, but by and large they achieved the targets. But I agree completely, if it is set in so unrealistically that it would need a resource allocation that would be going beyond the capacity of a current economy, and sometimes we do this with climate change targets or with changes with targets with respect to energy sources, primary energy sources, then we're creating disturbances in the systems. But I think the good thing about the Energiewende is that there is a constant reflection on this, and this has to be politically mitigated, of course, but a good governance, and therefore I would call this a good governance structure that Energiewende has, is able to reflect on, okay, relative prices have changed so much, or technological development has run into back ends, into dead ends here and there, and we have to change either the means or the original plan in order to pursue the final goal. And that is another prerequisite, and I think there are examples on how we can do it. On that we have to build.
Okay. We have another question.
У меня вопрос к господину Селе, или как правильно ударение. Меня зовут Сергей Николаев, я тоже занимаюсь инноватикой, прогнозированием и методологиями определения будущего. У меня очень много критики к концепции устойчивого развития ООН, на которые было сегодня несколько отсылок. В частности, в концепции устойчивого развития, по моим ощущениям, нет метрики технического, технологического развития вперед. И нет, собственно говоря, новой экономической модели, парадигмы, поскольку прежняя модель, я прошу прощения, капиталистическая, она себя исчерпала, что доказано, в общем-то, на мировой трибуне с 1993 года, в последнем высказывании в Давосе, 2010 годы. Пожалуйста, разубедите меня, есть ли в концепции устойчивого развития новая экономическая парадигма? Вот короткий ответ. Да, есть, либо нет, мы двигаемся по старому пути. А потом я задам второй вопрос.
I guess it's a question that all of us need to discuss. I do understand that, yes, when it comes to the innovation policy, there may be limitations. However, I think it's in the context of negotiations and unpacking what is the real objective of identifying those grand challenges. Yes, in terms of the underlying social system, they may not help us to transform. And in a sense, as you correctly putting, the intention is not, I don't think they're intended to necessarily change the accumulation mode of production or the advance of capitalism. But in a sense, you know, the choice is whether at what point do you want to struggle for change? Because the grand challenges identified, I think it's the poorer countries and the working class societies that are adversely impacted by those factors. And perhaps my view is that they may mitigate, but another struggle of transforming the social system would need to be advanced parallel to it. The STI policy has to somehow continue, and I think the presentation that Paul was indicating, perhaps we need to build on some of the thinking that they've begun to make in terms of how do we engage with these SDGs in a manner that when you operationalize them, they'll make a difference. I'm not so sure if I've responded to your question, but I do understand your question is much larger than, you know.
Ну хорошо, сейчас будет вопрос поуже, так сказать. На самом деле между Россией и Южной Африкой много общего, как ни парадоксально. Например, в Южной Африке много, как и в России, много, так сказать, безработных. Это первый огромный кластер людей. Во-вторых, есть такой тезис: в России десятки миллионов человек не зарегистрированы в экономической метрике. То есть чем они занимаются, ну вот правительство России не знает. Это второй кластер, огромный. Третий кластер – это трудящиеся люди, которые уже работают. Инновационное развитие предполагает, что, в частности, цифровизация экономики предполагает, что даже в работающих людях, так сказать, будет, в общем-то, десятки миллионов людей будут оттуда из экономики выдавлены благодаря новым цифровым технологиям. Возникает вопрос, куда девать всю эту, так сказать, массу людей, поскольку в совокупности мы получаем 90%, так сказать, населения трудоспособного, нужно куда-то пристраивать, чтобы они сами себя как-то кормили, да, так сказать, поскольку вот государству это не по силу. Как эту проблему решают в Африке, в Южной, значит, соответственно, в какие отрасли экономики предполагается интеграция освобождаемых людей? Очень конкретный вопрос. Какие отрасли экономики? Космос, сельхоз, я не знаю, добыча
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. In South Africa, we call it two economies. There's an informal economy and a formal economy. The informal economy, that's where the bulk of people who are trying their bits, but their economic activities and efforts are not normally counted in terms of economic terms. So there's that huge section of informalization, which I'm saying, and this is part of the conversation in South Africa, that if we want to unlock the challenge, the developmental challenges, we have to recognize that informal economy, which involves a number of people. I suppose you are saying in Russia, some people are not even counted, you do not know. It's the same in South Africa. You'll find a lot of people who wouldn't be counted actually being active in the informal economy. And I may not have the figures now, but it's quite a substantial proportion. So there's an effort to try and make sense of that informal economy. It's also linked to this notion. In South Africa, we have begun to go beyond the notion of social innovation, because in itself has its own limitation. We have now developed and embraced the notion of innovation for inclusive development, which also recognizes that you have people who are outside the formal institutions, the formal systems, who are innovating in a way that their innovation would not necessarily be considered within the formal or the innovation mainstream. And therefore, you've got to recognize those innovations that take place on the fringes of the economy, as it were. So that's the part that we are beginning to say, perhaps there is a space where we could intervene. We've got townships, the dwellers where people stay. A large proportion of black people, they stay in townships and villages, and they've been implementing or having some economic activities that have tended to be excluded. Now there is a focus to bolster township economies, right? So agriculture, of course, has been identified as a key sector because it's employing a large number of unskilled, semi-skilled labor, the majority of the working people. So the effort is to grow the agriculture. But of course, the irony is technology has actually improved agricultural productivity in South Africa. So and some of you will read the discussion now is actually around land in South Africa, land expropriation without compensation. I'm saying this because Theresa May has already, I mean, it's well known, has already threatened South Africa that if we go ahead with that policy, Europe may actually impose sanctions on South Africa. But this is the land question is at the heart of government policy. And Parliament has accepted this is what we want to implement. But it's not just land, it's lead to food productivity, to sustainability, to growing the economy. Again, part of intervening in the land is to open spaces for people who would otherwise be excluded to have opportunities. Mining, which has been a backdrop of South Africa's economy for many years, it remains so, but we know that it's been struggling. But it will remain. Now there are efforts to strengthen our ability to beneficiate so that we don't just become an exporter of raw materials, but we are also adding value. And this is part of the effort to utilize knowledge to at least bolster. But we also know that for historical reasons, mining has been relying on cheap labor, not just from South Africa, from the region, from SADC. So again, we are facing a real challenge where thousands, it's happening already. Thousands of people, of mine workers are actually being laid off because of advances in technology, and I think it's beginning to add to technology inequality. But part of our challenge as well is to think about how can we make sure that while technology leads to the destruction of jobs, but also it creates new forms of job which we can then accommodate at least the majority of young people that I've made reference to.
Thank you very much, Mlungisi. So with apologies, actually, I would like to give the last words to our discussant. We are aware that we are running late, but I actually really would like to hear his voice and what he would like to say.
I did make the recommendation that we are already having a discussion. There's really no point of me adding another layer of discussion to an already exhausted audience. So I don't have much to say beyond what already has been said. It has been very, very interesting, from the indicators to the mission-oriented, to the inclusivity part of science and technology innovation policies. I can cast doubt on a lot of the things said in a way of provoking further discussion. I think science and technology is an elitist field. I'm not sure it actually adds a lot to inclusivity. Mission-oriented, I think when people come together to set these missions, they have to reach compromise, and then by default and by design, the mission becomes, it builds within it contradictions and conflict. And when you come to assess the impact of these missions 10 years, 20 years later, you find that it has created more conflict. And you said something about governance, which again, because there will be resources attached to these missions, eventually you have a consortium of players around every mission. But those players will not operate in vacuum. There will be other players on other continents, in other countries, also working towards achieving certain parity with the EU in this particular respect, and they may have a negative or a positive implication for the mission. The gentleman who worked on the dashboard, on the indicators, I've done quite a bit of work on indicators, on innovation capability indicators. I think Russia is best compared and benchmarked with other resource-rich economies. I don't see much value comparing it with Ireland and Norway, for instance. But again, I wanted to be a little bit provocative towards the end of the day. I think you can measure the dynamics of the system by collecting indicators on the capabilities that exist within a country to access knowledge, to anchor knowledge, to diffuse it, to create it, and to exploit it. I think these are more useful categories to capture. Ultimately, the reason why government and policymakers are interested in innovation is to create value and to capture value. And this is also one of the thing I wanted to raise with regards to Wolfgang's presentation, that yes, you can achieve certain missions, but who captures the value? Will it be the Chinese or the Americans or who, right? So I just wanted to add this day with these reflections and provocations. And again, it was great being here. And have a pleasant evening, everyone. I'm tired too, as you could tell from my voice.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sami, and thank you everyone for staying longer with us. So the conference continues tomorrow morning, also with the foresight for Russian science and technology strategy priorities. So it starts at 10 o'clock and continues until